Toronto 2020. After 36 long years of silence, the truth finally stepped into the light. The Toronto Police Service held a press conference that would stop the nation in its tracks. Cameras clicked, voices hushed, and then came the words no one expected. We have identified the man responsible for the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop. For the Jessop family, for a man once wrongly accused, and for a community haunted for decades, that single sentence brought both closure and shock. Because the killer wasn't the quiet neighbor everyone once suspected. It was someone far closer. A friend. A man who had joined the search, attended the funeral, and even stood beside the grieving family offering comfort. Before we continue, let us pause for a moment of reverence. May Christine Jessop's soul rest in eternal peace. May her family and every family who has ever carried the burden of injustice find strength and healing. And may every viewer listening now be reminded that truth, no matter how long it takes, still has a voice. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to learn that everything you believed about them wasn't real? Have you ever lived in a community so close-knit that everyone seemed to know everyone, only to discover that evil had stood right among you, wearing the face of familiarity? Christine's story is not just about loss. It's about a system that failed, a man who lost 10 years of his life for a crime he didn't commit, and a small town that carried guilt long after the truth had been buried. It's about how science, persistence, and faith finally broke through decades of silence to expose the real killer, someone no one ever suspected. This is not your typical case of justice delayed. It is a story of how one tragedy multiplied into two: first, the murder of a child, and second, the conviction of an innocent man. Think about how many times we judge based on appearances or rumors. How often do we form conclusions without the full truth? In this story, those quick judgments destroyed lives. The desire for quick closure blinded investigators and misled a grieving town. What happens when truth takes decades to arrive? What does justice mean when the guilty are gone and the innocent have already suffered? Stay with me, because this case will remind you that even time cannot silence the truth. If you believe truth must always win, I invite you to support this channel, like, share, and subscribe. Here we remember the victims, question the powerful, and search for lessons hidden in real human stories. Now let's go back to where it all began. A quiet October afternoon in 1984, in a small town north of Toronto, where a 9-year-old girl named Christine Jessop set out to meet a friend and never came home. In the autumn of 1984, Queensville, Ontario, was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name, doors were left unlocked, and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. It was a small, quiet town, about an hour north of Toronto, safe, familiar, and filled with the kind of calm that made parents feel at ease. Among the children who filled those streets with laughter was a 9-year-old girl named Christine Jessop. Bright-eyed, gentle, and endlessly curious, she loved animals, especially her family's beagle, Freckles. Friends remembered her as cheerful and thoughtful, always ready to share a smile or lend a hand. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day, a goal that fit perfectly with her caring nature. Christine's parents, Bob and Janet Jessop, were devoted to their children, though life was far from easy. Just 2 weeks before the tragedy that would change everything, Bob had been taken into custody on charges related to financial mismanagement at his workplace. The sudden absence of a husband and father brought tension into the home, leaving Janet to shoulder the weight of holding the family together. She focused on maintaining a sense of routine for her children, especially for Christine and her older brother Kenny. Despite the stress that lingered in the background, Christine continued to approach life with optimism. Her teachers described her as disciplined and kind, a child who seemed older than her years in the way she comforted others. That Wednesday, October 3rd, 1984, was supposed to be ordinary. School, chores, maybe a trip to the park. No one could have guessed it would become the date that haunted a nation. That afternoon, Janet and Kenny planned to drive to Toronto to visit Bob at the detention center. Christine wanted to go too. She was eager to see her father, to tell him about her latest test at school and the tricks Freckles had learned. But Janet, trying to shield her daughter from the harshness of a jail environment, gently refused. "You'll see him soon," she said, leaving Christine at home after school. It was a decision made from love and caution, one that Janet would later revisit in her mind for the rest of her life. Christine came home from school between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. She dropped off her backpack, the small everyday motion that proved she had returned safely. Minutes later, she left the house again, walking to a nearby corner store. The shopkeeper remembered her clearly, polite, smiling, buying a pack of bubble gum. Christine said she was meeting a friend at the park nearby, a short walk, barely a few blocks away. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Janet and Kenny returned from Toronto around 4:10, they noticed Christine's bag sitting on the counter, untouched. At first, there was no panic, just the quiet assumption that she was at the park, laughing and playing as she often did. But as dusk approached and Christine still hadn't returned, Janet's worry turned to dread. Phone calls to neighbors, friends, and classmates brought no answers. Darkness settled over Queensville as Janet contacted the police. Word spread quickly. Within hours, volunteers filled the streets and fields, flashlights cutting through the night air as hundreds searched for the missing 9-year-old. They combed the woods, checked barns and ditches, calling her name again and again. Each hour that passed deepened the fear that something terrible had happened. For the next 3 months, the Jessop family lived in a limbo few can imagine. Posters bearing Christine's smiling face appeared on telephone poles and grocery store windows. Television broadcasts carried her story across Ontario. Strangers joined the search. The entire province waited, hoping for a miracle. But New Year's Eve brought an ending no one wanted. On December 31st, 1984, a farmer checking his land in Sunderland, more than 50 kilometers from Queensville, found the remains of a child. Within hours, police confirmed what everyone feared. The body belonged to Christine Jessop. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. The news devastated not only her family but the entire nation. What had once been a safe community was now marked by grief and suspicion. The innocence of Queensville was gone, replaced by unanswered questions and the heavy silence of loss. For Janet, one thought repeated endlessly, the decision she made that day. "If only I'd let her come with me," she later said. That simple, loving choice to protect her daughter would become a lifelong source of heartbreak. Christine's story became a warning about how fragile safety can be and how quickly an ordinary day can turn into tragedy. The community that once felt unshakable would soon find itself divided, as grief and fear turned neighbors into accusers. It was the last time anyone would see Christine Jessop alive. The search for Christine Jessop quickly became one of the largest community efforts Ontario had ever seen. Within hours of her disappearance, police officers, firefighters, and hundreds of volunteers began combing through the fields, woods, and back roads around Queensville. Flashlights moved like restless fireflies through the darkness as voices called her name again and again. Neighbors opened their homes to search teams, offering coffee and sandwiches through sleepless nights. Television stations broadcast Christine's photo, and newspapers carried her story for weeks. The whole province seemed united in one hope, that this smiling 9-year-old would be found safe. But as days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. Every field searched without results, every rumor that led nowhere, deepened the anxiety gripping the small town. People began whispering about strangers, cars that didn't belong, or faces they didn't recognize. Fear has a way of distorting memory, and in that atmosphere of panic, anyone who seemed unusual drew suspicion. Then came the discovery on New Year's Eve. Christine's body, found over 50 kilometers away in Sunderland, confirmed the worst. The heartbreak was indescribable. For her family, there was no closure, only questions that no one could answer. When a child is murdered, communities demand answers, and police feel the pressure to deliver them quickly. In 1985, that pressure fell squarely on the shoulders of the Durham Regional Police, who had taken over the investigation from York Region. What began as a search for truth soon became a desperate hunt for a suspect. In every neighborhood, eyes turned toward the people who didn't quite fit the mold. One of those people was Paul Morin, the Jessop's next-door neighbor. Morin was 24 at the time, a quiet man who worked in a furniture factory. He was intelligent but socially awkward, more comfortable with his clarinet and his bees than with small talk. He kept mostly to himself, which in most places wouldn't raise concern. But in a grieving town desperate for justice, his reserve became fuel for gossip. To some investigators, Morin seemed odd. He didn't join the public search parties or attend Christine's funeral, preferring to grieve privately. What many saw as shyness, police interpreted as guilt. When Christine's mother described him as the weird type guy who plays the clarinet, that passing remark became the spark that ignited a full investigation. Instead of collecting objective evidence, detectives began interpreting every action through the lens of suspicion. When Morin hesitated during questioning, they saw deceit. When he appeared calm, they saw coldness. When he smiled nervously, they saw mockery. It was as if the conclusion had already been written, and the evidence was simply being shaped to fit it. Soon, investigators built a theory that Morin had abducted and killed Christine after she returned home from school. But there was one major problem: the timeline. Janet and Kenny Jessop initially told police they returned home at around 4:10 p.m., which gave Morin little to no opportunity to commit the crime. Yet under repeated police questioning, they later adjusted that time to around 4:35 p.m., a change that expanded the possible window and conveniently aligned with Morin's movements that day. That shift, encouraged by investigators, became one of the first cracks in the foundation of justice. Police also collected fibers and hair samples from Morin's car and home. Forensic specialists claimed that a single hair found on Christine's necklace was microscopically similar to Morin's. Other fibers allegedly matched items from his car. The science behind these claims was weak, based more on visual comparison than measurable proof, but in the public's mind, it sounded convincing. Meanwhile, Morin's quiet demeanor continued to work against him. Some of his statements during interviews were odd but harmless. He spoke abstractly about morality and about children, growing up to be corrupted by the world. Detectives interpreted these philosophical comments as evidence of guilt rather than eccentricity. Within months, the pressure to make an arrest reached its peak. The case had dominated headlines, and both the media and public demanded justice. On April 22, 1985, as Paul Morin drove to a community band practice, police pulled him over and placed him under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessop. The moment news of his arrest broke, Queensville exhaled with a grim sense of relief. The community finally had someone to blame, someone to hate, someone who made sense in a story that otherwise defied understanding. People said, "Of course, it was him all along," but the evidence was thin, and the logic even thinner. No witnesses saw Morin with Christine, no fingerprints, no physical traces linking him to the crime scene. Yet to a community reeling from loss, these gaps didn't matter. They needed an answer, and Morin, quiet, different, and misunderstood, fit the image of a killer they could believe in. For the Jessops, it seemed justice might finally be near. For Paul Morin, it marked the beginning of 10 years of injustice that would destroy his peace, his reputation, and nearly his faith in humanity. It's easy to look back now and see the mistakes, the pressure, the bias, the misinterpretations. But at that moment, emotion outweighed reason. The true killer remained free, moving unnoticed through the same streets where Christine once played, while an innocent man was handcuffed in full view of his neighbors. Would you have believed he was guilty if you lived next door? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe. When Paul Morin was charged with first-degree murder, he was escorted to Whitby Jail, confused, frightened, and still believing that the system would recognize his innocence. For 10 months, he waited for his day in court, clinging to the hope that the evidence would clear his name. His first trial began in January 1986. Prosecutors built their entire case on shaky foundations, microscopic hair and fiber comparisons, and statements they insisted hinted at guilty knowledge. They painted Morin as a socially awkward loner obsessed with control, implying that his quiet nature concealed dangerous impulses. But Morin's defense team dismantled much of that narrative. They highlighted how subjective the forensic claims were. The supposed matches between fibers found on Christine's clothing and fibers from Morin's car could have resulted from environmental contact. The two families lived next door. The so-called microscopic similarities between hairs were meaningless without DNA testing, which was still in its infancy at the time. The defense argued that police had rushed to judgment, shaping their theory around a man who simply didn't fit into the community's mold. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with its decision. On February 7, 1986, Guy Paul Morin was found not guilty. For the first time in months, he was free to breathe. Outside the courthouse, his parents wept with relief. Reporters surrounded them, capturing the image of a man who had just survived a nightmare. The Jessop family, still mourning Christine, left court heartbroken, but determined to believe justice would someday make sense. For Morin, freedom lasted only briefly. 1 month later, the Attorney General's office filed an appeal, arguing that the trial judge had misinstructed the jury about reasonable doubt. The appeal was granted, and a retrial was ordered. Despite his acquittal, Morin would face the same accusation all over again. A rare and devastating reversal. The years between the trials stretched into uncertainty. Legal delays and appeals dragged on until 1992, when the second trial finally began. By that time, the case had already become infamous. The media framed Morin as the man who got away with murder, and the pressure on prosecutors to secure a conviction was immense. This second trial would become one of the longest in Canadian history, lasting 9 months, and one of its most controversial. Prosecutors reintroduced the fiber and hair comparisons, this time with even greater emphasis, calling expert witnesses who spoke with confidence but offered little scientific grounding. They added new testimony from witnesses whose stories had evolved over the years, shaped by memory, suggestion, and media coverage. One of the most damaging pieces of testimony came from Christine's mother, Janet Jessop. She told the jury that after Christine's funeral, she and others had heard a man's voice shouting, "Help me, oh God, help me," coming from the Morin residence. The claim was impossible to verify, yet it struck an emotional chord. To jurors already familiar with Morin's reputation as the odd neighbor, it felt like a sign of guilt. Even more disturbing was the introduction of a supposed confession. The Crown suggested that police officers had obtained a statement from Morin admitting involvement. It was later proven that no such confession ever existed. It was fabricated, a rumor allowed to grow until it took on the weight of evidence. Inside the courtroom, Morin's composure began to crumble. He had believed that truth alone could protect him, but truth was no longer the measure of justice. The prosecution had turned perception into fact and suspicion into certainty. When the verdict was announced in July 1992, Morin stood motionless, guilty of first-degree murder. The words echoed through the courtroom as if the air itself had turned heavy. He was sentenced to life in prison. Outside, reporters called it closure. Headlines declared the Christine Jessop case solved. But for anyone who looked closely, the celebration was hollow. The evidence hadn't changed, only the interpretation had. In Kingston Penitentiary, Morin spent his days reading, writing, and replaying every decision that led to this moment. He was not a man hardened by crime. He was a man buried alive by the system's need for a conclusion. While the public felt relief, the real killer remained free, walking the same streets, untroubled by the chaos left behind. Looking back, the failure was not born of malice alone. It was the product of desperation. Investigators wanted certainty more than truth. Prosecutors wanted a verdict that satisfied headlines, and a community scarred by grief wanted someone to blame. In that collision of emotion and authority, reason was the first casualty. This case would later become a textbook example of tunnel vision, when investigators focus so tightly on one suspect that every piece of information is bent to confirm that belief. The evidence that contradicted their theory was ignored, and the evidence that fit was celebrated, even when it defied logic. For Christine's family, the conviction brought temporary comfort. For Guy Paul Morin, it marked the destruction of his life as he knew it. The real killer was still free, and the innocent man sat behind bars. For 18 months, Guy Paul Morin lived behind the walls of Kingston Penitentiary, serving time for a crime he didn't commit. His name had been dragged through newspapers, his reputation destroyed, his life stripped to its core. Yet beyond those prison walls, something remarkable was beginning, a movement that refused to let his story end there. A group of lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens came together under a single cause: justice for Guy Paul Morin. They believed what the system had refused to see, that an innocent man was paying the price for a collective failure. Their mission was clear: to challenge the evidence, expose the flaws, and bring science into a courtroom that had long relied on assumption. At the heart of this movement stood advances in a technology still considered experimental at the time: DNA profiling. In the early 1990s, forensic science had evolved beyond the unreliable microscopic comparisons that had condemned Morin. Where once investigators could only guess, DNA could prove. Morin's defense team petitioned for the biological samples taken from Christine Jessop's clothing in 1984 to be tested again, this time with cutting-edge methods. The sample was old and fragile, but it held the key to truth. When the results came back in January 1995, they left no room for debate. The DNA from the crime scene did not match Paul Morin. It was a moment of pure vindication, a scientific declaration of innocence so definitive that even the most skeptical voices fell silent. On January 23, 1995, nearly 10 years after his first arrest, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Morin's conviction and entered a judicial acquittal. When the verdict was announced, Morin didn't celebrate. He simply wept. Years of stigma and isolation had taken their toll. Reporters asked if he felt relieved. He paused, then answered quietly, "Relief isn't the word. Truth is." The Crown prosecutor offered a public apology, acknowledging the unimaginable suffering caused by the wrongful conviction. The province of Ontario later issued an official statement of regret and awarded Morin $125 million in compensation, a symbolic gesture for a man who had lost nearly a decade of his life. But the victory wasn't his alone. It was a turning point for Canada's justice system, a moment that forced the country to confront how easily human error, bias, and pressure could destroy an innocent person's life. The same tools once used to accuse him had been replaced by science that could not lie. The exoneration reignited public faith in forensic truth, but also reopened the deepest question of all: if not him, then who? Christine's family faced that question with renewed heartbreak. They had believed the nightmare was over in 1992, only to learn that the man they'd thought responsible was innocent. The apology they offered to Morin was sincere, but filled with sorrow. They had grieved for Christine, then for justice, and now for the years lost to a false conviction. Investigators returned to the starting line. The case, officially reopened and handed to the Toronto Police Cold Case Unit, once again sat under the harsh light of scrutiny. Decades had passed, witnesses had aged, and evidence had degraded, but the mission remained the same: to find the real killer. In time, the case would come to represent more than one tragedy. It stood as proof that truth can survive corruption, that science can outlast failure, and that perseverance can correct even the gravest injustice. Paul Morin's ordeal became a cautionary tale in law schools and police academies across Canada. It reshaped investigative standards and inspired reforms that placed scientific validation at the center of criminal procedure. Most importantly, it reminded the world that truth, though delayed, never disappears. It waits to be discovered. If you believe technology can be a force for truth, make sure to subscribe. Here on, we tell stories where science redeems the innocent and gives voice to those whom time and injustice tried to silence. The exoneration had answered one question, but opened another. The world now knew who didn't kill Christine Jessop, but not who did, and so the mystery deepened once again. By 2019, 35 years had passed since Christine Jessop was taken from her family. Her story had faded from front pages, but never from the hearts of those who still wanted answers. For the detectives in Toronto's Cold Case Unit, the file sat like an open wound, a reminder that time may dull memory, but it does not erase truth. That year, investigators turned to a revolutionary method that had begun changing how unsolved murders were approached worldwide: Forensic Genetic Genealogy, or FGG. Unlike the traditional DNA testing that simply matched samples to known offenders, this new technique used advanced sequencing to build a complete genetic profile from even the smallest, most fragile biological trace. That profile could then be compared to public genealogy databases, connecting relatives through shared ancestry. In 2019, the Toronto Police partnered with Othram Inc., a specialized lab in Texas known for its precision with degraded samples. From the evidence preserved in the Jessop case, a semen sample collected in 1984, scientists were able to recover enough genetic material to create a detailed profile. Once uploaded to the database, distant family matches began to appear. The process was painstaking, requiring months of genealogical reconstruction. Investigators built family trees generation by generation, tracing potential lines that led back to Ontario in the early 1980s. The work was not dramatic, but it was methodical. Science and patience working together to accomplish what decades of human effort could not. By early 2020, a name began to surface repeatedly across the genetic threads: Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984. He lived in Toronto and was known casually to the Jessop family. His wife, Heather, worked with Christine's father, Bob, at a telecommunications company. The connection was friendly: dinners, community events, and the occasional visit. To the Jessops, Hoover was just another familiar face in their circle. When investigators looked deeper, the connection became chilling. Hoover wasn't just aware of the Jessop family. He had joined the community search for Christine when she went missing. He had attended her funeral. He had stood in their home during the wake, comforting a grieving family while carrying the secret that he was the one who took their daughter's life. The irony was unbearable. For 36 years, the wrong man had carried the stigma, while the true killer had lived and died among them without suspicion. Investigators submitted Hoover's name to the database and began searching for a reference sample. To their astonishment, they discovered one already existed. Hoover had died in 2015 in Port Hope, Ontario, by suicide. During the post-mortem process, a small blood sample had been retained in a provincial database. That discovery meant there was still a chance for absolute confirmation. When the cold case unit compared the DNA from the 1984 semen sample to Hoover's preserved blood sample, the result was a perfect match. The case that had haunted Canada for nearly 4 decades was finally solved. On October 15, 2020, Toronto Police Service held a press conference to announce the breakthrough. Interim Chief James Raymer stood before the cameras and stated, "If he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessop." For the Jessop family, the moment was overwhelming. After decades of grief, wrongful accusations, and unanswered questions, they finally had a name. Christine's brother Kenny said through tears, "You keep hoping for 36 years that something will happen, and it finally did. We can stop looking backwards now." For Guy Paul Morin, the announcement brought peace. In a written statement, he said, "I am grateful that the Toronto police stayed on this case and have now finally solved it. When DNA cleared me in 1995, I knew that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has." The public reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. How could the man responsible have been so close, so involved, and yet so invisible for so long? Even in resolution, there was sorrow. Hoover's death meant he would never stand trial, never face the families he destroyed, and never answer the questions that still echo. The police appealed for more information about his past, searching for any links between Hoover and other unsolved crimes from that era. After 36 years, Christine's story had come full circle, from innocence to tragedy, from false guilt to final truth. The case proved that science could do what human judgment could not: separate fact from assumption. But the truth came with a heavy cost. It cleared an innocent man and gave closure to a grieving family. But it also revealed that the real killer had lived and died without justice. The killer helped search for the child he murdered. The truth, when it finally arrived, brought both peace and pain. For the Jessop family, knowing the name of the man responsible for Christine's death meant that the years of wondering had ended. The uncertainty that had haunted every sunrise for 36 years was finally over. Yet closure did not erase the sorrow. Christine would always be 9 years old, frozen in memory, smiling in photographs that time could never age. Her brother Kenny thanked the Toronto police for never abandoning the case. His voice trembled as he said, "This doesn't bring her back, but it brings peace. Now we can let her rest." Those words carried the weight of every sleepless night, every moment spent reliving the past, and every false lead that ended in disappointment. Guy Paul Morin, the man once branded a killer, responded with quiet grace. His written statement was not angry, it was grateful. "I hope the Jessop family can now have closure," he wrote, "and I thank everyone who fought for truth." After everything he endured, the years behind bars, the whispers in public, the loss of trust, he chose forgiveness over bitterness. His strength became a lesson in dignity. Across Canada, the revelation shook people who remembered the case. The nation had seen how human error and pressure could destroy an innocent life. Communities realized that justice was not just about solving crimes. It was about protecting fairness. In the years following Morin's exoneration, the government of Ontario commissioned the Kaufman Report, a landmark inquiry that examined how such a miscarriage of justice could happen. Justice Fred Kaufman's investigation exposed the dangers of assumption, the misuse of forensic evidence, and the culture of tunnel vision that had led police and prosecutors astray. The report's findings transformed how Canada handled criminal investigations. It emphasized the need for independent forensic review, transparency in evidence sharing, and strict oversight to prevent confirmation bias. These reforms, born out of Morin's suffering, became his unexpected legacy, a system stronger because of what he endured. Christine's case continues to be taught in universities and police academies, not as a story of failure alone, but as an example of how truth can emerge through persistence. It reminds everyone in law enforcement that compassion must guide investigation, and that the quest for justice must never outpace the pursuit of truth. When the truth finally came, it asked for humility, from the police who admitted their mistakes, from the courts that sought reform, and from a nation that learned to question before condemning. Let us pause for a final reflection. May Christine Jessop rest in everlasting peace. May every innocent person still waiting to be heard find freedom and light. And may every seeker of truth never lose faith in what time, science, and perseverance can reveal. If stories like this move you, join our community by subscribing. Here at Solved Cases, we remember the victims, we learn from the past, and we pray for a world with fewer cold cases. Justice delayed can still be justice delivered, and the truth, no matter how long it hides, will always find its way home.